Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So Ben Miller posted something on Facebook earlier which I thought, that's a really good bit of medieval manuscript context that I can do a very short video about. And it's a good example, so showing the image here now, of a, let's call it Viking era, but basically Carolingian, so probably 8th century, manuscript showing the scene of David and Goliath. Now in the telling of David and Goliath, particularly if we look at the pictorial representations of the slaying of Goliath by David in medieval Bibles, manuscripts, we usually see first of all the scene of him using his sling to throw a stone and obviously strike Goliath in the head. And then we see Goliath usually on the floor in the process of dying or perhaps dead, and we see David picks up Goliath's sword and beheads Goliath with his own sword, because David is just, you know, he's poor, he doesn't own his own sword, he's just using a sling, so he uses Goliath's own sword to behead him. Now this is a good example where, taken in isolation without knowing the story of David and Goliath, some people would look at this and go, it's a Viking longsword, it's a Dark Age two-handed sword. And of course it's not, it's a giant's sword. It's a giant-sized Viking era, or should we say Carolingian, sword. So it's a sword somewhat like this, but obviously scaled up for a giant, someone who's maybe like 10 feet tall or something. So obviously little David, who's a little boy, I don't know how old he's supposed to be, maybe about 8 years old or something like that, has picked up this giant sword. It's a big two-handed one with a huge hilt, instead of these really tight, compact hilts that you actually got on Dark Age swords. It's a big one because it's for a giant's hand. Like, imagine Hagrid, imagine Harry picking up Hagrid's sword, if Hagrid had a sword. And so obviously he can fit both hands on it, and he needs to fit both hands on it to wield this huge heavy sword, and also to chop off this enormous giant's head through a thick neck. So obviously it's a giant sword, it's not a two-handed sword, and as far as we know, there is zero evidence there is zero evidence for any type of two-handed Viking sword. And now I am aware of that there's one archaeological example where around the internet, around maybe 10 years ago, maybe a bit less than that, maybe 8 years ago, lots of people posted this picture around going, it's a Viking longsword, it's amazing, blah blah blah. But the fact is, it's actually just a more or less normally proportioned Viking era sword, but it's got a narrower blade than normal, a narrower crossguard therefore, and a narrower pommel. But actually the hilt is really of normal length. So, but in a photograph, when you don't have any reference point, you don't have anything to compare it against, at first sight it looks like a long hilted Viking era sword, but actually it's just a narrow Viking era sword with maybe a slightly longer tang than normal. But it's in no way a two-handed sword. And the final thing to mention is also in context, knowing the story, knowing why is that medieval picture showing this thing. It's a giant sword. It's not a Carolingian longsword. It's simply a biblical, mythological giant's sword being used by a very small boy. So context is everything when you're interpreting medieval sources, whether they're pictorial or text sources. And just to mention text sources, so some people use certain medieval bits of text to support the idea that a two-handed sword is appearing in use. And very often, when you actually go and look at the text, it actually says, oh, these people, they took their sword, they threw down their shields and they gripped their swords two-handed and hewed the enemy down and stuff like this. Well, if we look at medieval art, other medieval art, which doesn't show a giant sword, it shows a conventional size sword, you sometimes see swords, whether they be later arming swords or Viking era swords or Frankish or Anglo-Saxon, we sometimes see them gripped like this, where literally a person is holding two hands together. And of course you could absolutely use a sword like this. So yes, you can grip one of these swords in two hands, but you can't fit two hands on it. So there we go. You've got to be very careful of written sources as well, and be very critical of, is this describing a two-handed sword or just a sword being held two-handed. And remember, sometimes, in some cases, they might even mean, by putting two hands on the weapon, they might mean something completely different, like half-swording. Anyway, there we go. Thanks to Ben Miller for posting that picture up of David and Goliath. It's a beautiful picture, beautiful illustration, French, I believe, of the 8th century. And just a reminder, it's a very good wake-up call that whenever we're looking at medieval sources, you have to be critical and ask, what is the context of this? What is it showing? And particularly when we're talking about arms and armour, is this showing the weapons like this because it's a giant's weapon? Is it showing it because it's a foreigner's weapon? So they're showing something exotic, or trying to show, maybe, you know, typical thing is showing falchions when they're showing Islamic enemies, for example, in Crusader art, and they don't really know what an Islamic sword looks like, so they give them some kind of wacky European falchion with a funny shaped blade. Doesn't mean that object ever existed, it just means that they're trying to show a strange exotic thing. Anyway, thanks for watching. Give us a like and a subscribe. See you soon for another video on Scholar Gladiatore channel. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.